So in the previous video, we actually installed Git, we created our GitHub account, and also configured our SSH into our GitHub account. But today, we are going to answer a bigger question. What exactly is Git? And why do all these companies, like Google, Netflix, Microsoft, all of them rely on it? And where does this GitHub actually fit in? So in this video, I'm going to answer all of these questions for you, and I'll take you through a specific timeline of the history as well. Now, the first problem of this basically started, with a simple project. So just imagine that there are, five different developers working on your specific project, and all of them are working on the same project, right? So like we have five project. Let's say someone wrote like project final, write some zip file, and someone decided to write slash final latest, right? Zip, okay, some latest underscore new, and too many of the files that have been created around with multiple different developers who are working on the same project. So this basically create multiple problems, like the files are basically getting overwritten, right? Because one developer creates a new version basically gets created, and he renames it to a uh, something new, right? So files are getting overwritten. There is no history attached to it, right? And also you cannot track, so you cannot literally track who changed what. And at this point, if you have already realized the problem, it's literally impossible to have any collaboration, right? So all these four problems basically led to the birth of something called as the version control systems. So we call it as a VCS. This is the idea of having it. Now, let me take you to a bit of the history lane of how these version control has evolved over the period of time. Right. So the first version, basically came. The first version was something called as a local version control. That was the first version, a local version control. So the idea of the local version control was that developers were supposed to store the versions locally. So let's say you created a file, you wrote the file version 1, again the same next version of file, let's say file version 2, file version 3, and stuff like that, right? And so tools stored the file, all the file differences internally, right? But there was one problem, right? It on the problem was that it just works on only on one computer, right? On one machine. So you can just, whatever machine it is working on, you just have it, right? There's no collaboration to it, right? You cannot collaborate with it. And what if like the system is crash, right? Let's say something bad happens to the system, and if the system basically crashes down, which means your entire history is gone too, right? And this is like a challenge which was there. So how did we overcome with that was that we talked about something called as a centralized. So we moved from local version control to something called as a centralized version control, and this is I'm talking in terms of around 1986. So in 1986 we moved to something called as the centralized version control. In other words, a lot of places you will find out it's written as CVCS, right? So what was this idea about CVCS, right? So the idea was very, pretty simple, right? So developers are basically, so all the developers are basically going to put the code, make the changes of the code to a central server, right? Central server. And this central server is the one where so all the developers, whatever the developers are, all the developers are going to put across in this specific server. So all the code are basically stored in this central repository itself. Okay, so it was pretty much good. It enabled this problem that you cannot work in collaboration manner. So it evolved to a part where multiple developers could work together. It did had a central server maintaining a versions as well. So these are two important factor which was basically being there. However, there were a couple of problems which it kind of had it, right? So first of all, it was pretty slow, right? That was the initial stage, and there was also weak branching strategies which were there. So there was no proper branching strategies there. Like for example, if I want to work on something, you want to work on something, how do we handle the conflict and stuff like that. So it was pretty much weak at that back of the that point, right? And obviously since it's not a central server, so this data corruption, right, risk is always supposed to be there. So that risk is was supposed to be there. Now fast forward, so CVCS, which is Centralized Version Control, was actually there for quite some time over the decade. It was still there in the market for quite very long period of time. However, there were then a team at Apache came back and say, hey, you know what? If you're supposed to do with the CVCS, then let's do it right. And that's how, right, something called as an SVN got developed, which was a subversion by the Apache. So it's called as an Apache subversion. And this is something like, my bad, subversion. This is something around 2000, early 2000. So I'll just write down the year 2000 for it. So the whole idea was it is supposed to make the centralized version control system do it in the right way, right? So it's not challenging or changing anything which the architecture of the CVS works on, but to fix the CVS limitations. So it did the same thing. It basically had some improvements. So it now had a better version tracking, right? It had an atomic commits, and then it also has something called as a directory versioning, right? Right. So how the workflow was? So workflow was, yeah, this is the first time then they created a proper workflow, which means you do a checkout of the code, right? You check out a specific branch or a specific part of the code, and then you do an edit of the file. You do whatever change that you want to make. Then you finally do a commit to your changes, and finally you put them back onto the centralized server that was there. Right? However, as you can see, it still had few problems into the system. And one of the few problems was, first of all, the central server failed problem. Right, central server fail. Right, so if the central server fails, the entire project is stopped. Now, since it's connected with a network, right? So if there is no internet in no internet, right? Which means no commit. And we're talking in terms of the early 2000 when the internet was still not that very popular to every part of the places, right? So yeah, that was kind of a challenge at that point. So no internet, it just doesn't work, right? And same way, like if the server gets corrupted, things basically work, right? So you can say, like, SVN at that point was more like Google Doc, but without an offline mode, right? Online, everyone can work together. It worked perfectly fine, but it had problem in working with doing an offline side as well. Now, at this point, they did realize that, hey, uh, how can we solve this problem? There's a lot of research where working around multiple places, people were talking about it, and then they introduced a new revolutionary idea, something called as the distributed version control, right? So distributed version control was kind of the groundbreaking stuff. So distributed version control, or we say DVCS, right? Okay, so now the whole idea was that every developer has a complete copy of the repository plus history. That was the first idea, right? So every single developer who are basically working on the ecosystem, right, they they will have this copy of I'll just draw some more laptop for them. Okay, so everyone will have a copy of the repository. So repo copy, right? Repo copy, and the history too, right? Plus the history of whatever the changes that has been made. So the history will also be there in everyone's copy, in everyone's laptop. Just like how blockchain works, and if anyone knows about the blockchain, this is like the starting point. So every developer has the complete copy of the repository plus the history. Now the best part is no one has to be dependent on a central server. So there was no dependency on the central server. Best part is even if there is an offline, there's no internet, you can still work around with it, right? Faster operations, everyone has full history locally, easy branching, merging technology, merging way, plus had a very safer backups as well. So if something goes bad in one laptop, you still have the backup maintained around in multiple distributed ecosystem as well. So this kind of solve this specific concept basically solve the problem. And this is where it was basically a turning point, this idea, because the same idea was basically being taken by someone who was already facing a lot of problem with these version control and was maintaining the one of the probably the biggest the open source project at that point, and that was Linux. So the founder of the Linux, which is the creator of the Linux, I would say, Linus Torvald, he was facing the same problem. So he decided to build something called as the BitKeeper, right? So that was like the first version control which was kind of being used during the Linux control Linux kernel development, and that was basically called as the BitKeeper, which ultimately became to be called something called as the Git. And this is I'm discussing, like, this discussion is around 2005, right? So he built Git in just few weeks, with the idea of having a goal that, hey, you know what, I want to have something extremely fast, right? Something distributed, that needs to be distributed, follow this distributed person control idea, has to be secure, right? And should support thousands of contributors altogether. So the core philosophy of the Git, you know basically came that, hey, I'm not going to track files, but instead I'm going to track snapshots, right? So no files at this point. It was all about a snapshot. And this is the biggest conceptual difference, right, of the Git with the other versions that we have actually, you know, looked forward, right? So that basically changed how the idea basically, was there. So traditional system was about, version 1, there's a difference, then you come across with the version 2. So I'll compare with, those sort of the things as well. So traditional system was, hey, let's say I have a version 1, you make some changes, you go to a version 2, so obviously there will be a difference on it. Then again you make some changes, obviously there's a difference, right? You go to a version 3 and stuff like that, right? This was a tradition. With Git, the idea was that you have a snapshot of one, right? Then you have a snapshot of two, right? And so on and so forth, right? So each commit is equal to, you can say like, hey, it's a picture of the entire project altogether. So any one commit that you make, it's a picture of an entire project. And why we say it's a very fast, it's extremely fast. Why? Because Git at this point was utilizing something called as a SHA-1 hashing. Okay, it had something called as the content addressing as well. Then it did compressed the content, right? So it had this compression as well, right? And it was storing everything local. It was working on the locally. So obviously, since no network was there, so network lag was not supposed to happen, right? That because that basically limited down the local storage as well. So most of the operations at this point was happening locally. So Git has three main areas at this point, right? Where Git kind of fits in. So how the Git basically had the three main area was, let's say you have a working directory, right? Inside the working directory, you have something called as a staging area, right? Post a staging area, we call it like an index. And then you had a repository, right? And inside this repository, there was something called as a .git folder, which basically stores the history, right? This staging area is more like a preparation area, right? Working directory is the part where you write your specific code. So three part, which consist of the Git. Now, it kind of worked around for quite some time, right? But however, people realize that that we are still going to have, we still need to kind of work something on top of it, right? So I mean that was the idea, like how it became uh, a next set of problem for the other people. So by 2008, and we're moving now to 2008 now, right? So the three developers, if I'm not wrong, it was Jack Holman, right? We had Tom Preston and Chris Van Strath, right? So three of the developers asked, what if these Git repositories that we are basically creating, what if they, you know, you store them on the internet, right? So, and that's how that's how the idea of the GitHub basically got created, right? So they came across with an idea of GitHub. So the idea of GitHub was not to replace the Git, but to add few functionality on top of it, which means the remote repository, right? Something like a pull request, the concept of the pull request, and we'll talk about these, all of these things in the upcoming video, like a code review, right? Some collaboration, UI, right? a nice looking UI where you can do all this collaboration, and made an open source ecosystem, right? It's part of an open source ecosystem. Okay, so Git is like a version control engine, and you can say GitHub is more like a social network for the code. So it was a part of the 2008, and that basically changed on how the entire version control is basically being managed in the modern development altogether. So modern developer, all the developers, they write a Git. So they have this uh, local history, right? And I'm talking now on the modern developers, right? So either they have this local history, they put their source goes onto the GitHub as well for the collaboration, right? And then post that you can also connect them to some CI/CD pipelines as well in order to have these cloud deployment altogether. So Git plus GitHub became the foundation of the DevOps, all the open sources, microservices, and the cloud native system as well, right? So just a quick recap of the timeline as well, what we have observed. So started from 1980s, early 1980s, right? Where it was all manual file versions. Then around 1986, right, where it was more about a centralized version control basically came down. So almost after 1.5 decade, around 2000, right, where the SVN came back and it improved this VCS. And by 2005, Linus Torvalds was having a nightmare in maintaining its own Linux operating system, the kernel. So he decided to create something called as the Git, right? So by 2008, the three developers, decided to connect the internet to these, distributed version control system as well, and that's how the GitHub was basically born. And this is what you see the modern day software engineering as well, where we connect with Git, it becomes a source of truth. You can do a lot of automations from it, and how you are basically doing a lot of connecting a lot of things like CI/CD pipeline, the deployment, and kind of a very basic for all the different multiple teams who is working in an IT industry as well. So Git solved the problem of version control, GitHub solved the problem of collaboration, and together they basically changed how the entire world builds the software altogether. So in the next video, we'll finally step inside the Git. We'll talk about the repositories, commits, staging area, and how Git actually tracks your code. So see you in the other video. Thank you. Have a nice day.